You don't need that, Arthur. It's an eyesore and a liability, Julian Vane barked, his voice echoing off the limestone walls of my driveway in Bryn Mawr. He was standing in front of my brand-new Silver Star Legacy, a custom-built, Haichamnamui, Kongdola luxury motor coach that represented 40 years of high-stakes corporate litigation and missed vacations. Julian, my son-in-law, had the kind of face that always looked like he was smelling something sour, a trait he'd perfected since marrying my daughter and moving into the guest wing of my estate. I stood there, my hand resting on the polished chrome of the side mirror, feeling the cool morning mist of the Pennsylvania main line. It's not for you to decide what I need, Julian. I've spent my life reading the fine print for people who wanted to take things that didn't belong to them. I think I know a good investment when I see one. Julian stepped closer, his expensive loafers clicking on the cobblestones. He was a real estate developer by title, though most of his projects seemed to involve developing ways to spend my money. Tomorrow, Victoria and I are taking the kids on a trip. We're taking the coach. And as for you? We've already made the arrangements. We're dropping you off at the Hawthorns. The Hawthorns. I knew the name. It was an assisted living community, a sanitized term for a place where wealthy families parked their elders until the estate taxes were settled. My heart didn't race. It went cold. It was the same coldness I'd felt in boardrooms when a hostile takeover was initiated. I looked past Julian toward the house, where my daughter, Victoria, was watching from the upstairs window. She didn't wave. She didn't even look away. She just pulled the silk curtain shut. "You're putting me in a home?" I asked, my voice as steady as it had been the day I'd argued before the Supreme Court. "For your own safety," Julian said, a smirk dancing on his thin lips. "You're 65, Arthur? You're buying $250,000 toys you can't drive and talking about wandering the country like a nomad. It's erratic, irresponsible. It's evidence, really." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. In my line of work, the man who screams first has already lost the case. Instead, I simply reached into my pocket and felt the weight of the spare key. "I see," I murmured. "I suppose there's no talking you out of this?" "The bags are packed, Arthur. The coach is leaving at dawn. Be ready." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving me alone with my toy and the silence of a house that no longer felt like home. I hadn't always been an old man to be discarded. 6 months ago, I was the senior partner at Harrison, Finch, the man who knew where everybody was buried in the Philadelphia insurance world. I had spent 40 years calculating risk, predicting human greed, and ensuring my clients were protected against the very thing that was currently standing in my driveway. When my wife Eleanor passed 4 years ago, the light in the big house went out. I'd stayed for Victoria. I'd funded Julian's failed luxury condo project in Manayunk because she asked me to. I'd ignored the whispers, the snide comments about my slowing down, and the way they talked about my retirement fund as if it were a communal pot. I had bought the Silver Star Legacy in Westchester just 3 days prior. It was a masterpiece of engineering heated floors, a gourmet galley, and a master suite that rivaled any 5-star hotel. It was my escape pod. I'd spent hours the night before spreading out topographical maps of the Pacific Northwest, marking the spots in Montana where the sky felt big enough to breathe. I remembered the call to Victoria the day I signed the paperwork. I'd been so proud. "Tori, honey, I finally did it. I'm going to see the world. I'm starting with the coast and heading up to the Canadian border." There had been a long, chilling silence on the other end. "How much, Father?" she'd asked. Not, "Are you happy?" Or "Is it safe?" Just the number. 250,000, I'd said, trying to keep the enthusiasm in my voice. "It's a legacy piece. It'll last 20 years. That's $250,000 out of the liquidity," she'd whispered, her voice sharp as a razor. "Julian needed that for the Kensington project. You're being incredibly selfish, don't you think? At your age, you should be focused on the family's stability, not playing explorer." I'd hung up feeling like a child who'd been scolded for breaking a vase. But the next morning, I'd gone back to the dealership and done something I hadn't told her. I'd sat with my old friend Silas, a man who specialized in creative asset protection, and we had a very long conversation. Now, standing in the shadows of my own garage, I realized that conversation had been the most important one of my life. The morning of the vacation arrived with the brutal efficiency of a military operation. Julian and Victoria were downstairs by Sao, Kong A.M., their 2 children, Sterling and Chloe, trailing behind them with iPads and designer backpacks. They didn't even look at me as they loaded the coach. They treated me like a piece of furniture they were moving into storage. "The car is waiting to take you to the Hawthorns," Victoria said, pausing in the foyer. She was wearing a beige cashmere travel suit, looking every bit the prestigious mainline matron. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's for the best, Dad. You'll have friends there. A schedule. You won't have to worry about, well, anything." "I've spent my life worrying about everything, Victoria," I said quietly. "It's a hard habit to break." Julian came in, tossing a set of keys in the air and catching them. My keys. The ones he'd taken from the kitchen island the night before. "She's a beauty, Arthur. Drives like a dream. We'll be sure to send you a postcard from the Outer Banks. If they let you have mail in the special care wing." He laughed, a sharp, grating sound, and ushered the family out. I stood at the window and watched them pull away. The Silver Star Legacy lurched slightly as Julian navigated the narrow gate, his ego clearly larger than his driving skill. The black Lexus followed, driven by a hired hand to bring them back after their borrowing was over. I waited until the sound of the engine faded. I waited until the driveway was empty and the house was silent. Then, I walked into my study. I picked up my phone and opened my messages. I had one contact open. Julian. I typed 4 words. "Look in the glove compartment." I hit send and watched the little blue bubble disappear. Then, I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of the Motnien Chin Tram Tarmui Hai Bordeaux I'd been saving for a special occasion, and sat down. I knew exactly what would happen next. Julian would be miles away by now, likely hitting the Pennsylvania Turnpike, feeling like the king of the road. He'd see the message. His curiosity, or his arrogance, would get the better of him. He'd reach over, click the latch of the glove box, and find the heavy, cream-colored envelope I'd tucked inside. Inside that envelope wasn't the registration. It wasn't the insurance. It was a copy of the revised Harrison Family Trust, freshly notarized and filed 48 hours ago. It was a document that stripped Victoria of her position as executor and named a local veterans charity as the sole beneficiary of my estate. But more importantly, it contained a very specific clause regarding the Silver Star legacy. My phone began to vibrate on the mahogany table. It was Julian. I let it ring. Then Victoria's number popped up. I ignored that too. The vibrations were aggressive, sliding the phone across the wood. I took a sip of the wine. It was perfect. They didn't know that I hadn't just bought a motor coach. I had bought a trap. Bamoy Lum years of insurance litigation had taught me that people only reveal their true colors when they think they've already won. Julian thought he was driving a trophy. He didn't realize he was driving the evidence of a felony. I stood up and walked to the front door. A white sedan was pulling into the driveway, not the car for the retirement home, but a private investigator I'd hired named Jax. He stepped out, a folder in his hand and a cigarette behind his ear. "They just crossed the county line, Mr. Harrison," Jax said, tipping an imaginary hat, "and they're doing 80 and a 70. You ready to pull the rug?" I looked back at the house I'd gifted to Victoria 3 years ago, in a moment of sentimental weakness. A gift that, according to Pennsylvania law, could be revoked under very specific circumstances of gross ingratitude. "Jax," I said, my voice cold and clear, "I don't want to just pull the rug. I want to take the whole floor." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare ignition fob. I pressed a button, and miles away, the GPS tracker on the Silver Star Legacy went live, broadcasting its location directly to the state police barracks in King of Prussia. I told him to look in the glove compartment. I whispered to the empty air. I didn't tell him that I'd already reported the vehicle stolen. I didn't know it yet, but the look on Julian's face when the blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror was going to be the most satisfying thing I'd ever imagined. And that was just the first mile of a very long road. I sat in my study, the silence of the massive house pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. On the mahogany desk sat the Motnien Chin Tram Tarmui Hai Bordeaux, the deep crimson liquid catching the dim light of the afternoon sun. Most people think of wealth as a shield, a fortress of brick and bank accounts that keeps the world's ugliness at bay. But as I sat there, a 65-year-old man who had just been evicted from his own life, I realized that wealth is often more like a beacon. It doesn't just protect, it attracts the kind of people who see human beings as nothing more than vaults waiting to be cracked. I didn't become a senior partner at Harrison, Finch, by being a fool. I had spent 40 years in the trenches of corporate litigation, specializing in the high-stakes world of insurance fraud and asset protection. I had seen every trick in the book: the accidental fires, the staged car wrecks, the elaborate shell companies designed to hide millions from a spouse. I knew the anatomy of a lie better than most doctors knew the human body, and yet I had let the biggest lie of all grow right under my own roof. I looked at the framed photograph on the corner of the desk. Eleanor. She was laughing in the picture, her hair windblown on a deck in Martha's Vineyard. She had been the anchor of my life, the person who kept my cynicism from turning into poison. When cancer took her 4 years ago, the anchor didn't just snap, it took a part of the ship with it. I was adrift, drowning in a grief that made the halls of this estate feel like a mausoleum. That was when Victoria started leaning in. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone in this big house," she'd said, her voice dripping with a practiced, honeyed concern. "It's too much for you to manage. Julian and we want to move in. We want to take care of you. We want the kids to grow up with their grandfather." At the time, it felt like a lifeline. I wanted to be a grandfather. I wanted the sound of children's laughter to drown out the silence Eleanor had left behind. So in a moment of sentimental weakness that would have horrified the younger version of myself, I did the unthinkable. I signed a gift deed. I handed over the keys to the Bryn Mawr estate, the limestone walls, the 5 acres of manicured gardens, the history of my life to my daughter and her husband. I told myself it was just estate planning. I told myself it was an act of love. I didn't know then that I wasn't giving them a home. I was giving them a weapon. The shift happened so slowly I almost missed it. It started with the guest wing. Julian suggested it would be more comfortable for me, no stairs to climb, a private entrance, closer to the garden. It sounded reasonable until I realized I was being tucked away, moved from the master suite I'd shared with Eleanor for 30 years into a space that felt like a high-end hotel room. Then came the renovations. Julian, with his visionary real estate mind, decided the house needed a modern touch. He tore out the library where I'd spent my career, replacing my hand-carved oak shelves with minimalist glass and steel. He sold the antique furniture Eleanor had spent decades collecting, calling it clutter. "We're just updating the legacy, Arthur," Julian would say, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "You want the property value to stay competitive, don't you?" But it wasn't just the house. It was the Kensington project. Julian had come to me 18 months ago, breathless with excitement about a luxury condo development in a gentrifying part of Philadelphia. He needed liquidity. He needed a bridge loan. Victoria had sat beside him, clutching my hand, her eyes wide and pleading. "It's Julian's big break, Dad. If we pull this off, we're set for life. We won't have to worry about the kids' tuition or the estate taxes. Please, just this once." I'd written the check. $5 million. I'd told myself it was an investment in my daughter's future. But 6 months later, the project was stalled, the contractors were suing, and Julian was looking at me not with gratitude, but with resentment. To a man like Julian Vane, a benefactor is just a reminder of his own inadequacy. He didn't want my help, he wanted my absence. The first real warning sign came during a dinner party last Christmas. The house was full of the prestigious crowd Julian so desperately wanted to belong to, men in tailored suits and women with frozen faces. I was sitting at the end of the table, listening to Julian hold court. "The problem with the old guard," Julian said, swirling a glass of my best scotch, "is that they don't know when to let go of the wheel. They sit on these massive assets, letting them stagnate while the market moves on. Sometimes, you have to help them see that it's time for a transition, for their own benefit, of course." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Victoria caught my eye and quickly looked away. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. He wasn't talking about the market. He was talking about me. A few weeks later, I found the first brochure. I had gone into Julian's home office, the room that used to be my sanctuary, to look for a stray piece of mail. There, sitting on top of a pile of legal documents, was a glossy pamphlet for the Hawthorns. It featured a picture of a smiling elderly man playing chess under a willow tree. "Luxury memory care for the discerning senior," the headline read. I felt a surge of indignation. Memory care? My mind was as sharp as a forensic scalpel. I could still recite case law from memory. I still managed my own diversified portfolio. But Julian was building a narrative. Every time I forgot my reading glasses or misplaced a set of keys, he'd make a show of it. "Getting a bit foggy today, aren't we, Arthur?" he'd say loudly enough for the staff or Victoria to hear. "Don't worry, we'll handle the paperwork. You just rest." It was a slow-motion gaslighting, a deliberate attempt to paint me as a man in decline. And Victoria was his accomplice. She didn't lead the charge, but she stood by and watched it happen, her silence a form of betrayal that hurt more than Julian's arrogance ever could. She was my daughter, the girl I'd taught to ride a horse on these very grounds, and she was letting her husband erase me from my own home so they could salvage their failing lifestyle with the remnants of my life's work. That was when I decided to buy the Silver Star Legacy. It was my act of rebellion. I didn't tell them. I didn't ask for permission. I went to the dealership in Westchester, met with a man who understood that at 65, adventure is just another word for survival, and I paid cash. I wanted something they couldn't touch, something that moved, something that represented a horizon they couldn't gate. When the coach was delivered to the driveway 3 days ago, the explosion was immediate. Julian had looked at the Hai Trum Namui, Kong Dola price tag, and seen his condo project's interest payments. Victoria had looked at the coach and seen her father finally stepping out of the guest wing and into the world. "You're being reckless, father," she'd screamed in the foyer, her voice echoing up to the vaulted ceiling. $250,000 on a bus, while we're struggling to keep this estate afloat. It's erratic. It's proof that you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking very clearly. Victoria, I'd said, my voice dangerously calm. I'm thinking that I've spent 40 years building a legacy so that you could have everything, and you're mad because I spent a fraction of it on a way to finally see the country I've only ever seen from an office window. Julian had stepped in then, his face a mask of false empathy. Arthur, we're worried. This kind of impulsive spending, it's a symptom. We've been talking to some specialists. We think a structured environment, like the Hawthorns, would be much better for you, just for a trial period, while we get the estate's finances back in order. A trial period. That was the lie. They wanted me in a room where they could control the visitors, control the phone calls, and eventually control the power of attorney. They were trying to perform a corporate takeover on my very existence. I'd looked at them both, my daughter and the man she'd chosen, and I'd seen them for exactly what they were. They weren't family, they were creditors. What they didn't know was that I had already made a call to Silas. Silas Montgomery was an old money lawyer from the Rittenhouse Square set, a man who dealt in the kind of secrets that stayed buried for centuries. We had spent 4 hours in his wood-paneled office the day before the vacation. They're going to move on you, Arthur. Silas had warned, his eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. The gift deed was a mistake, but it's not an irreversible one. Pennsylvania has a gross ingratitude statute. If a donee commits a grievous wrong against the donor, we can petition to revoke the gift. But we need more than just hurt feelings. We need a clear, documented act of betrayal. They're planning to put me in a home and take my motor coach for a joyride, I'd told him. Silas had smiled, a slow, predatory grin. Then let them take it. In fact, make it easy for them. Give them the keys. Let them drive that $250,000 asset right across the state line. Because the moment they do, Arthur, they aren't just your family anymore. They're defendants. And so, I had waited. I had played the part of the defeated old man. I had watched them pack their designer luggage into my dream. I had let Julian mock me in my own driveway. I had even let them think they were dropping me off at the Hawthorns. But as the Silver Star Legacy disappeared around the bend of the driveway, I wasn't headed for a retirement home. I was headed for my study. I took another sip of the Bordeaux. The richness of the oak and dark fruit coated my tongue. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Julian. I knew he had finally opened the glove compartment. I knew he had seen the revised trust. I knew he was realizing that the man he thought he was robbing was actually the man who had just set his entire world on fire. What Julian didn't know was that the state police weren't just looking for a stolen vehicle. They were looking for a vehicle being operated by a man who had no legal right to be behind the wheel, because 48 hours ago, I had also filed a formal revocation of his authorized driver status on every policy I owned. The trap was snapped shut. But as I looked at the photo of Eleanor, a single thought haunted me. I had won the first round, but the battle for my home and my daughter's soul was only just beginning. What happened next would change the Harrison name forever. The vibration of my phone against the mahogany desk sounded like a death rattle in the silent room. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. I could almost hear Julian's voice through the glass, sharp, frantic, and losing that polished Ivy League veneer he used as a mask. I looked at the clock. It had been exactly 45 minutes since they'd pulled out of the driveway. They would be somewhere near the Valley Forge exit by now, the Silver Star Legacy gliding effortlessly down the turnpike. Or at least, it had been gliding until Julian opened that glove compartment. I imagined the scene, the kids arguing in the back, Victoria staring out the window at the rolling hills of Chester County, and Julian reaching over, expecting to find the manual for the satellite system, only to find the death warrant for his lifestyle. The text started coming in a barrage. Arthur, pick up the phone. What the hell is this? You think this is a joke? And then, the one that made me lean back and close my eyes. Victoria is hysterical. You've had a breakdown. We're coming back to handle this. Handle this, I whispered to the empty room. That was Julian's favorite phrase. He didn't solve problems. He handled them, usually with someone else's checkbook. I stood up and walked to the window, watching Garrett Miller, my groundskeeper, move methodically across the lower lawn. Garrett was a man of few words and immense loyalty. He'd been with us since Victoria was in diapers. He was the one who had seen the accidents Julian had been orchestrating over the last few months. It started with the slippery stairs. I'd walked out onto the back porch one morning to find a thin, nearly invisible layer of industrial grease on the top step. If I hadn't been wearing my heavy-soled garden shoes, I would have gone head-first into the stone fountain. Julian had been the first one there, helping me up before I'd even fallen. "Careful there, Arthur," he'd said, his grip on my arm uncomfortably tight. "Balance isn't what it used to be. Maybe we should look into those stability rails." Then there was the medication. I'm a man of habit. I take a single blood pressure pill every morning with my coffee. One Tuesday, I felt a strange, leaden fog settle over my brain. By noon, I couldn't remember the name of my own firm. I'd found an extra pill in my dispenser, a heavy-duty sedative that looked remarkably like my heart medication. When I mentioned it to Victoria, she just patted my hand with that devastating, pitying smile. "You're just getting confused, Dad. That's why we're so worried. It's exactly why Julian suggested we take over the management of your prescriptions." I realized then that they weren't just waiting for me to fade away, they were helping the process along. It was a psychological siege. Every mistake I made was documented. Every time I misplaced my keys Julian had moved himself, it was added to the evidence folder they were building for the incompetency hearing. I looked down at the documents Jax had delivered. It was a secondary folder, one Julian didn't know existed. It contained photos taken by a hidden camera I'd installed in my own study 3 weeks ago. The photos showed Julian and Victoria sitting at this very desk, going through my private files while I was supposedly napping in the guest wing. In one shot, Julian was holding my original will, a look of pure, predatory hunger on his face. "He's desperate, Arthur," Silas had told me during our secret meeting. "The Kensington project isn't just stalled, it's a Ponzi scheme. He's been using new investor money to pay off the old ones, and the well has run dry. He needs your estate, and he needs it now. He's not just looking for an inheritance, he's looking for a bailout." I had felt a pang of genuine grief then. Not for the money I had more than enough, but for Victoria, my little girl, who used to sit on my lap and ask me to tell her stories about the law monsters I fought in court, had married a monster of her own. And instead of fighting him, she had become his apprentice. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from a number I recognized, the Pennsylvania State Police. I picked it up. "This is Arthur Harrison," I said, my voice crisp and professional. "Mr. Harrison, this is Trooper Brennan. We've intercepted the Silver Star Legacy coach reported stolen from your residence. We have the vehicle stopped on the shoulder of I-by-Moisar West. The operator is claiming he has permission to use the vehicle. He's identifying himself as your son-in-law, Julian Vane." I took a slow breath. This was the moment of no return. Once I said the words, the bridge back to my family would be nothing but ash. I thought about the grease on the stairs. I thought about the sedative in my pillbox. I thought about the memory care brochure. "Trooper," I said, "Mr. Vane does not have permission. In fact, I have a signed affidavit from my attorney stating that I revoked his access to all my property 48 hours ago. He took the keys from my home without my consent while I was being—" I paused, the word sticking in my throat, "while I was being coerced into a medical transport. He's also claiming your daughter is in the vehicle, sir," the trooper said, his voice softening slightly. "She's quite upset." "My daughter is a guest in that vehicle," I said, sticking to the script Silas and I had rehearsed. "But the vehicle itself belongs to me, and it was taken without authorization. I want to press charges, Trooper. Grand theft auto, and I want the vehicle recovered and returned to my estate immediately." "Understood, Mr. Harrison. We'll take it from here. We're going to have to ask the occupants to exit the vehicle and wait for a transport. We'll be in touch regarding the formal statement." I hung up. My hand was shaking. Just a little. I looked out the window again. Garrett was standing by the gate, watching for the return of the coach. He knew what was coming. He was the only one in this house who still saw me as a man, not an ATM. I went to the kitchen and began to pack a small bag. Not the suitcase Victoria had packed for me filled with polyester slacks and senior-friendly slip-on shoes, but my own gear. My hiking boots, my heavy wool sweaters, my passport. I didn't know it yet, but Julian wasn't going to go quietly. A man like that, cornered and exposed, doesn't just surrender. He lashes out. He'd already spent months trying to prove I was losing my mind, and I had just given him the ultimate piece of crazy behavior to show a judge. Grandfather arrests his own family during a vacation. It would look terrible in the local papers. It would look even worse in a courtroom. But I had spent my life in courtrooms. I knew that the truth isn't what happened. It's what you can prove. I heard a car pull into the driveway. It wasn't the coach. It was Jax's black SUV. He climbed out, looking at his watch. "The tow truck is on its way to the highway, Arthur," Jax said as he walked into the kitchen. "And the state police just called for a second unit. It seems Julian didn't take the exit the vehicle command very well. He tried to drive off." I felt a cold shiver of dread. "Were the children hurt?" "No," Jax said, his expression grim. "They boxed him in before he could get up to speed, but he's in handcuffs now. And Victoria, she's telling the officers that you're suffering from a psychotic break. She's demanding they take her to the house so she can secure you." I looked at the bag I'd packed. I looked at the house Eleanor and I had built, the house that was currently being used as a staging ground for my destruction. "She's coming here?" I asked. "With an emergency psychiatric hold order," Jax said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "I have a contact in the county clerk's office. They filed it this morning, before they even left for the trip. They weren't just dropping you at the Hawthorns, Arthur. They were going to have you committed." The room seemed to tilt. They hadn't just been planning a vacation. They'd been planning a kidnapping. The vacation was the distraction, the moment I'd be most vulnerable. "How long do we have?" I asked. 10 minutes. "Maybe 15, Jax said. "The police will bring her here because she's the concerned daughter. They don't know about the trust yet. They don't know about the theft report being a counterstrike. To them right now, you're a confused old man, and she's the hero." "Then we don't wait for the coach," I said, grabbing my bag. "Garrett," I yelled toward the back door. The groundskeeper appeared in seconds. "Sir?" "The keys to the old Bronco," I said. "The one in the carriage house that Julian thinks is junk. Is it ready?" Garrett grinned, a rare, sharp glint in his eyes. "New battery, full tank of gas, and I hid your emergency files under the spare tire like you asked." "Good," I said. "Jax, you stay here. When the police arrive with Victoria, you give them the folder, the real folder, the one with the photos of the grease on the stairs and the sedative pills. You tell them that Mr. Harrison isn't having a psychotic break. He's escaping an assassination attempt." As I ran toward the carriage house, I heard the distant wail of sirens. They were coming for me, not to save me, but to lock me away, in a gilded cage, until my heart finally gave out, or Julian's management of my meds finished the job. I climbed into the Motngin Chinchum Chinwe-born Ford Bronco, a rugged, rust-collared beast that had been my favorite vehicle for 20 years. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a defiant, guttural growl. I looked in the rearview mirror as I sped down the back service path, avoiding the main gate. I saw the blue and red lights flashing through the trees at the front of the estate. Victoria was there. She was screaming my name, her face twisted in a mask of concern that I now knew was nothing but greed. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to stay free long enough for Silas to get before a judge. I was a fugitive in my own life, driving a 30-year-old truck through the backwoods of Pennsylvania while my daughter tried to steal my mind. But as I hit the open road, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt dangerous. What Victoria and Julian didn't realize was that they hadn't just attacked an old man. They had attacked a Harrison. And Harrisons never, ever lose the house. I reached over and flicked on the radio. A low, bluesy guitar filled the cabin. I looked at the road ahead, stretching out toward the mountains. The chase was on, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one being hunted. I was the one setting the pace. And I had one more surprise waiting for them back at the estate, something I'd buried in the basement years ago that would make the Kensington project look like a playground dispute. The smell of old leather and gasoline in the Motngin Chinchum Chinwe-born Bronco felt like a homecoming. It was a visceral, honest scent that stripped away the sanitized, floral-scented lies of the Bryn Mawr estate. I watched the needle on the speedometer climb as I navigated the winding backroads of Chester County, heading toward the Delaware Water Gap. I was 65 years old, a multi-millionaire, and according to the documents in my daughter's hands, a danger to myself. I kept the headlights off for as long as I dared, relying on the moonlight reflecting off the silver-green cornfields. I knew every curve of these roads. I'd driven them for decades, usually in a Mercedes or a Jaguar, cocooned in luxury while I negotiated the destruction of smaller men. I had been the one who drafted the clauses that ruined people, I knew how the system worked because I was one of its architects. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, searching for the blue and red flicker of police lights, I realized I'd never been on this side of the glass. I was the prey now. I didn't know it yet, but the move Julian had made, the emergency psychiatric hold, was more than just a way to stop me from changing my will. It was a tactical strike designed to freeze my assets. Under Pennsylvania law, if a judge found probable cause for an emergency evaluation, my accounts could be locked until a guardian was appointed, and Julian had made sure he was first in line for that role. The first hook was set, and I was the one dangling from it. I pulled into a small, nondescript gravel lot behind a closed diner near Valley Forge. I needed to think. I reached under the passenger seat and pulled out a burner phone Silas had given me weeks ago. There was one message from Jax. "The police are at the house. Victoria is playing the grieving daughter for the local news. They've issued a silver alert for you, Arthur. They're telling the public you're armed and confused. Stay off the main roads." Armed and confused. It was a brilliant, devastating play. By labeling me armed, they'd ensured that any police officer who stopped me would approach with their weapon drawn. One wrong move, one reach for my wallet, and Julian's problem would be solved permanently by a nervous rookie with a badge. I sat in the dark, the engine ticking as it cooled. I thought about the secret I'd alluded to back at the house. Julian thought his Kensington project was failing because of market shifts and contractor disputes. He thought he just needed my $5 million to bridge the gap. He was wrong. 3 years ago, before I'd even met Julian, Harrison, Finch had been approached to insure the very land that project now sat on. I'd done the due diligence myself. The site was an old chemical processing plant from the Motgin Chintrum-born Muis. The soil wasn't just contaminated, it was a toxic soup of chromium and lead that had never been properly remediated. I had the original, unscrubbed environmental survey, the one that proved the land was legally unbuildable for residential use. The one Julian had clearly lost, or replaced with a forged document when he applied for his construction permits and investor funding. I'd kept a copy of that report in a lead-lined box buried beneath the floorboards of the wine cellar. Julian had spent months renovating the house, but he'd never touched the cellar. He thought it was just a place for old man juice, as he called my vintage collection. He didn't realize it was a vault for his own destruction, but I couldn't get back to the house to retrieve it. Not yet. The burner phone buzzed. This time, it was a call. "Arthur." Silas's voice was low and urgent. "The judge signed the Bartram-Lair High Order. You have exactly 72 hours to present yourself for a voluntary evaluation, or they'll issue a warrant for your arrest. Victoria's lawyer is claiming you tried to run Julian off the road with a $250,000 motor coach. I was at home when that happened, Silas. Jax can testify to that." "Jax is currently being detained for questioning regarding your disappearance," Silas countered. "They're squeezing him. Julian is playing dirty, Arthur. He's telling the police you've been hallucinating about a chemical conspiracy. He's using your knowledge of the Kensington site against you, making it sound like a paranoid delusion." The manipulation was masterful. Julian had taken the truth and turned it into the very evidence of my insanity. If I showed up and talked about the toxic soil, the doctors would just nod and write it down as a fixated delusion. "I need that report, Silas," I said, my voice rasping. "It's in the cellar, under the third rack of Bordeaux." "Forget the report for a second," Silas said. "You need to worry about the Silver Star. The state police have it in a secure impound lot, but Julian's lawyer is already petitioning for its release. They want the coach back, Arthur. They want the evidence of your erratic behavior." "Let them have the coach," I said, a cold smile forming in the dark. "But they'll have to find the second envelope first." "What second envelope?" "The one I taped to the underside of the master bed's frame inside the coach," I whispered. "It contains the wire transfer records from the Harrison Family Trust to Julian's private offshore account in the Caymans. Records he thinks I never saw. Records that show he's been skimming from my estate for 2 years to pay off his gambling debts in Atlantic City." There was a long silence on the other end. "Arthur, you've been sitting on this?" "I'm a litigator, Silas. I don't fire until I can see the whites of their eyes. I wanted to give Victoria a chance to come clean. I wanted her to be my daughter again." But she chose her side. "If Julian gets that coach back and finds those records, they'll disappear," Silas warned. "He won't find them," I said, "because he's too arrogant to look under the bed. He thinks I'm a broken old man who spends his days looking at maps. He doesn't think I'm the man who can trace a penny through 3 shell companies and a Swiss bank." I hung up and started the Bronco. I couldn't stay in the lot any longer. I needed to move. I spent the next 6 hours driving through the winding mountain passes toward a hunting cabin I'd bought in my wife's name 30 years ago. It wasn't on any of my current asset lists. It was a ghost property, a place Eleanor and I used to go when we wanted the world to forget we existed. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. I was exhausted, my bones aching from the tension. I pulled the Bronco behind a thicket of hemlocks and walked to the cabin. I pushed open the door. It smelled of pine and dust. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in a wooden chair by the window and watched the forest wake up. My phone, the real one, the one I'd kept off, suddenly vibrated in my pocket. I'd turned it on for a split second to check the time. A notification popped up. A video had been posted to Victoria's social media 5 minutes ago. I clicked it. It was Victoria, standing in front of my house, her face pale and tear-streaked. She was holding a photo of me and her children. "Dad," she sobbed into the camera, "please, if you can see this, just come home. We aren't mad about the motor coach. We just want you to get the help you need. The doctors say you're in a state of fugue. You're not yourself. Sterling and Chloe are asking why Grandpa ran away. Please, don't do this to them." The comments below the video were a torrent of sympathy. "Praying for your family, Victoria. So sad to see a great mind go like that. I hope they find him before he hurts himself. She was good. She was very good. She was using my grandchildren as bait, casting me as the villain in a tragedy of my own making." But then, the video panned slightly, and I saw something in the background that made my blood run cold. Standing in the shadow of the porch was Julian. He wasn't crying. He was looking at his phone, a sharp, triumphant glint in his eyes. He caught the camera for a brief second before Victoria stopped filming, and in that second, he held up something small and metallic. It was my spare ignition fob for the Bronco. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Garrett, my loyal groundskeeper, the man who had prepared this truck for me. He hadn't been helping me escape. He had been tagging me. I looked at the dashboard of the Bronco. Tucked deep behind the radio console, I saw a tiny, blinking red light, a GPS transponder. They hadn't issued a silver alert to find a confused man. They had issued it so the police would do the dirty work of tracking me while Julian followed behind to secure the evidence. I stood up, grabbing my bag, but the sound of gravel crunching in the distance stopped me. A pair of headlights cut through the hemlocks, sweeping across the cabin's front window. It wasn't the police. The vehicle was too quiet. It was a black SUV. I didn't know it yet, but the voluntary evaluation period was over. Julian wasn't waiting for the law anymore. He was coming to handle this himself. And in the middle of the Delaware Water Gap, there were no witnesses. I looked at the back door of the cabin, then at the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. What happened next changed everything. I whispered to the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs. Because Julian forgot one thing about insurance men. We always calculate the cost of a total loss. I moved toward the back door just as the heavy tread of boots hit the porch. The floorboard groaned under the weight of an intruder, a sound that felt like a gunshot in the pre-dawn stillness of the cabin. I didn't reach for the iron poker. Not yet. I stayed in the shadow of the heavy wingback chair, my breathing shallow, my mind racing through the logic of the situation. Julian was here. He hadn't brought the police, because the police would have required paperwork, sirens, and witnesses. Julian wanted a private resolution. He wanted to handle me before I could speak to a judge or a journalist. The front door creaked open further. The silhouette of Julian Vane was unmistakable wide shoulders, the arrogant tilt of his head, and the glow of a cell phone screen illuminating his face from below, like a villain in a low-budget thriller. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man I didn't recognize, someone thick-necked and dressed in a dark tactical jacket, not a cop, hired muscle. "I know you're in here, Arthur," Julian said, his voice smooth, almost conversational. "The GPS says you've been stationary for 20 minutes. There's nowhere else to go. You're 65, you're tired, and frankly, you're making this much harder on yourself than it needs to be." I stayed silent. I wanted him to keep talking. I wanted him to feel the vacuum of the room and fill it with his own ego. That was the mistake Julian always made. He assumed silence was a sign of surrender, not a tactical choice. Garrett was a good investment, wasn't he? Julian continued, stepping into the center of the room. He began to pace, his boots clicking on the pine floor. The old man's loyal groundskeeper. It only took $50,000 to flip him. 50,000 of your money, mind you. He told me about this place. Said you and Eleanor used to come here to disappear. Well, Arthur, you've disappeared. And now, we're going to make sure you stay that way for a while. He gestured to the man behind him. This is Silas. No, sorry, not your lawyer, Silas. This is Jax's replacement. Let's call him a transport specialist. We have a private clinic in upstate New York waiting for you. No silver alerts, no messy headlines. Just a quiet, comfortable room where you can have your breakdown in peace while Victoria and I fix the mess you've made. I stood up then, stepping out of the shadows. The light from Julian's phone caught my face. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a man who had just finished a very long, very successful closing. You've spent a lot of my money today, Julian, I said, my voice echoing in the rafters. Garrett's loyalty, the transport specialist, the private clinic. It's a shame you didn't spend some of it on a better lawyer. If you had, you'd know that entering a property owned by a trust you've been removed from is called breaking and entering. Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. The Batrum-Lair High Order says I'm your guardian, Arthur. I have the legal right to secure your person. And as for the house, Victoria still has the deed. You revoked the gift, but the paperwork hasn't cleared the recorder's office yet. We're still in the gray zone, and I thrive in the gray zone. Is that what you call the Kensington Project? I asked, taking a step toward him. A gray zone? Because the EPA calls it a Superfund site. And the SEC is going to call it securities fraud when they see the forged environmental impact reports you used to secure those construction loans. Julian stopped pacing. The smugness on his face didn't vanish, but it stiffened. You don't know what you're talking about. You're confused, Arthur. That's the narrative. Remember? I know that you've been skimming from the Harrison Family Trust to pay off Jax, the real Jax, the PI I hired who was actually working for you the whole time. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the floor fell out from under me. I had assumed Jax was my man. I had assumed the folder he gave me was the truth. But as I looked at Julian's face, I realized the photos of the grease on the stairs, the sedatives in the pillbox, those weren't evidence Jax had found for me. They were props Julian had planted for Jax to find, so that I would feel paranoid, so that I would flee, so that I would look exactly like the confused, armed, and dangerous old man the Silver Alert described. Julian had been playing both sides of the board. He hadn't just been trying to commit me. He had been driving me into a state of genuine terror to justify the commitment. Jax is a professional, Arthur, Julian whispered, leaning in close. I could smell the expensive peppermint on his breath. He's been sending me every recording, every document, every secret plan you've made for the last 3 weeks. I knew about the Silver Star. I knew about the change in the will. I let you think you were winning because a man who thinks he's winning becomes careless. You ran, Arthur. You fled a police stop. You're a fugitive. And now, you're going to have an episode in this cabin that requires physical restraint. He nodded to the man in the tactical jacket. The man stepped forward, reaching into his pocket for a pair of heavy-duty zip ties. What happened next changed everything, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. Because Julian forgot one thing about this cabin. He forgot that Eleanor wasn't just my wife. She was the daughter of a man who built bunkers during the Cold War, and she hated intruders. I didn't reach for the iron poker. I reached for the small, innocuous-looking brass lamp on the end table and twisted the base 45 degrees to the left. The sound was a heavy, hydraulic thump. In the kitchen, the massive cast-iron stove, a relic from the Motngin Chintrum High Muis, slid 6 inches to the right, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the foundation. But more importantly, the shutters on every window in the cabin slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang. They weren't wood, they were reinforced steel, painted to look like rustic cedar. "What the hell is this?" Julian shouted, his phone light darting around the now pitch-black room. "It's a safe room, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the darkness. "The whole cabin is. Once the shutters are engaged, the only way out is through the service tunnel in the basement, which requires a biometric scan of my thumb. Your specialist can try to kick the door down, but it's rated for a battering ram. We're stuck in here together. Just the 3 of us, until the real police arrive." "The police are looking for you, Arthur," Julian screamed. "They were," I said. "Until 10 minutes ago, when I used the satellite uplink in the basement. The one you didn't know about, to blast the unscrubbed environmental reports for the Kensington Project to every major news outlet in Philadelphia, along with the recording I've been making of this entire conversation." I held up the burner phone. The little red light was glowing. I hadn't been talking to Silas. I had been broadcasting a live audio feed to a cloud server managed by a firm in London that Julian's money couldn't reach. "You're recorded, Julian. The transport specialist, the plan to kidnap me, the admission of the $50,000 bribe to Garrett. It's all out there. The silver alert just became a search warrant for your arrest." The man in the tactical jacket froze. He looked at Julian, then at me, then back at Julian. He was a professional, and professionals know when a job has turned into a prison sentence. "He's lying," Julian hissed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "He's an old man with a phone. Break the door. Now." The specialist didn't move. "The shutters are steel, Vane. I'm not getting through that without a torch, and if he's broadcasting, I'm out." He backed away, toward the kitchen, but there was nowhere to go. We were in a box. A high-end, pine-scented box. "You think you've won?" Julian said, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. "I'll kill you before they get here. I'll tell them it was self-defense. A madman in a bunker. They'll believe me." He slammed into me, throwing me back against the wingback chair. For a man of 65, I was fit, but Julian was younger, fueled by the desperate adrenaline of a man whose life was dissolving in real time. We hit the floor, and I felt the air leave my lungs. His fingers dug into my neck, cutting off the oxygen. "Where is the code?" He wheezed, his eyes bulging. I couldn't breathe, let alone speak. The world began to gray at the edges. I saw the shadow of the specialist standing over us, undecided. I saw the flickering light of Julian's phone on the floor. But then, through the thick, steel-reinforced walls, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't my heart. It was a helicopter. And then, a voice boomed from a loudspeaker outside, so loud it vibrated the very floorboards we were fighting on. "This is the Pennsylvania State Police. We have the building surrounded. Occupants, come out with your hands raised." Julian froze. His grip on my throat loosened just enough for me to gasp in a lungful of dusty air. He looked toward the door, his face a portrait of crumbling arrogance. "How?" he whispered. "The GPS. I had the GPS." "I didn't move the GPS, Julian." I coughed, pushing him off me with the last of my strength. "I put the Bronco's transponder on a logging truck heading for Canada 2 hours ago. The police aren't here because of the silver alert. They're here because a concerned citizen reported a kidnapping in progress at an unregistered bunker." I stood up, smoothing my wool sweater, my neck burning where his fingers had been. I felt a strange sense of calm. The humiliation of the last few months, the memory care brochures, the grease on the stairs, it was all being burned away by the cold reality of the law. "What happened next changed everything," I whispered, watching as the transport specialist put his hands on his head and knelt on the floor. Because as the police began to breach the steel shutters with a thermal saw, Julian didn't pray. He didn't cry. He reached for his phone and made one last call. "Victoria," Julian said into the phone, his voice shaking. "They're here. Destroy the drive. Destroy everything in the wine cellar. Now." I watched him, a sad, broken man clinging to a sinking ship. He didn't know that Victoria wasn't at the house. He didn't know that she was currently sitting in the back of a squad car at the bottom of the hill, having been picked up an hour ago for questioning. But as the first sparks of the thermal saw cut through the front door, I realized the biggest twist of all was still waiting for me. Because while I had been protecting my money and my mind, I had completely missed what was actually hidden in that wine cellar. And it wasn't just a document. The thermal saw bit into the reinforced steel of the door, throwing a shower of white-hot sparks that illuminated the cabin in strobe-like bursts of violence. Julian backed away from the door, his face pale, his eyes darting toward me with a mixture of hatred and sheer, unadulterated panic. He was still holding his phone, the line to Victoria presumably dead or ringing into the void. "You think this is a victory?" Julian hissed, his voice trembling. "They're going to see a barricaded man. They're going to see a specialist I hired to protect you from yourself. They're going to see the stolen Bronco. You've built your own cage, Arthur." I didn't answer. I watched the door. I had spent 40 years believing that the law was a precision instrument, a scalpel that could cut away the rot of human greed. But as the door finally buckled and the heavy oak frame groaned, I realized that the law is often more like a sledgehammer. It's loud, it's messy, and it doesn't care who it hits as long as the job is done. The door burst open. "State Police, hands in the air. Get on the ground. Now." The command was a physical force. Flashlights cut through the dust and smoke, blinding us. I felt the cold barrel of a rifle near my temple before I was shoved onto the pine floor. My cheek pressed against the rough wood, the same wood Eleanor and I had polished by hand 30 years ago. I felt the heavy weight of a knee in my back, the sharp bite of metal cuffs around my wrists. "I'm Arthur Harrison." I managed to choke out, the dust clogging my throat. "I'm the owner of this property. The man over there, Julian Vane. He's the one who kidnapped me." "Shut up," the officer barked. I looked up, squinting through the glare. Julian wasn't on the ground. He was standing near the kitchen, his hands raised, but his posture was calm, calculated. He was already wearing his distraught family member mask. "Thank God you're here." Julian sobbed, the performance so convincing it made my stomach turn. "He's had a complete break. He's got a transmitter in the basement. He's been talking about toxic soil and conspiracies. He nearly killed me." The officer in charge, a man with a weathered face and Miller on his nameplate, looked from Julian to me. He saw an old man in a rumpled sweater, pinned to the floor in a hidden bunker. He saw the armed and dangerous, silver alert subject. "We have the Betrayal high order, Sergeant," Julian said, stepping forward as if he were part of the team. "He needs to be transported to the Hawthorns immediately, for his own safety. He's dangerous." "Search him," the sergeant ordered. They went through my pockets, pulling out the burner phone and the satellite uplink remote. I looked at the burner phone, the one that was supposed to be broadcasting the truth. The screen was black. The signal, I whispered, panic finally beginning to rise in my chest. The broadcast. "The phone is dead, Arthur," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear as he walked past me, escorted by an officer. "Jax didn't just give me the recordings. He gave me the kill codes for your secure server. You weren't broadcasting to the world. You were broadcasting to a hard drive in my briefcase." I felt the world tilt. My safety net had been a noose. Everything I had said in this cabin, my admissions of the hidden reports, the offshore accounts, the trap I'd set, wasn't a broadcast for the police. It was a recorded confession for Julian to use against me. He had my voice, my plans, and my location. He hadn't been caught in my trap. He had let me build it around myself so he could walk away with the keys. What happened next was the moment I hit rock bottom. I said to the shadows of the police cruiser as they loaded me into the back. Because as we drove away from the cabin, I saw Julian standing on the porch, lighting a cigarette with my favorite gold lighter. He wasn't being arrested. He was being protected. And I was being hauled away to the one place I knew I would never leave. The ride to the psychiatric evaluation center was a blur of rain and blue lights. I sat in the back, the cuffs chafing my wrists, realizing the depth of my failure. I was a litigator who had been out-litigated. I was an insurance man who had failed to cover his own life. By the time we reached the facility, not the Hawthorns, but a more clinical, high-security ward in Westchester, the sun was fully up. I was stripped of my clothes and given a paper-thin gown. My belongings, including the spare ignition fob and the keys to the estate, were placed in a plastic bag and handed over to Julian Vane. I was placed in a room with a single bed bolted to the floor and a window that didn't open. For 24 hours, I was left alone. No phone calls, no lawyer, no Silas. The doctor who finally saw me was a woman named Dr. Sterling Cold, professional, and clearly well acquainted with the Vane family's contributions to the hospital's foundation. "Mr. Harrison," she said, looking at a tablet, "your daughter and son-in-law are very concerned. Your behavior over the last 48 hours, the high-speed flight, the barricading of yourself in a bunker, the claims of environmental conspiracies. It all points to a severe manic episode, possibly exacerbated by early-onset dementia." "I have the reports, doctor," I said, my voice cracking. "The Kensington project is built on toxic soil. Julian has been laundering money. If you let me call my attorney..." "Mr. Vane has provided us with recordings of these reports," she said, giving me a look of deep, professional pity. "He says you've been obsessed with this toxic soil fantasy for months. He's worried you're trying to destroy his career because of a perceived slight regarding a motor coach." She tapped the tablet. "Under the Betrayal high order, we are holding you for a mandatory 72-hour observation. During this time, your daughter Victoria has been granted temporary emergency guardianship of your person and your estate." "No," I whispered. "She can't. She wouldn't." "She already has, Arthur," a voice said from the doorway. It was Victoria. She was dressed in black, her eyes red as if she'd been crying for days. She walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bolted-down bed. "Doctor." Sterling stepped out, giving us privacy. Dad? Victoria said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away. Please don't be like that. We had to do it. You were going to ruin everything. Julian told me about the files. He told me how you were trying to frame him for fraud just because you didn't want us to have the house. He's lying to you, Victoria, I said, my heart breaking. The soil is toxic. He's using your name on the permits. If the SEC steps in, you're the one who goes to prison, not him. He's insulating himself with you. She shook her head, a single tear tracking down her cheek. Julian loves me. He's trying to save our family. He's the one who found what you were hiding in the wine cellar, Dad. I froze. What did he find? Not just the reports, she said, her voice turning cold. He found the letters, Dad. The letters from Eleanor. The ones from before I was born. I felt the air leave the room. The letters. I had forgotten about them. Or rather, I had buried them so deep in my psyche that they had become a part of the foundation of the house itself. She was going to leave you, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling with a new, sharper kind of anger. She had a plan to take me and go to Europe. She had the bank account set up. She had the tickets. And then, she got sick. And you kept the letters. You kept them as a trophy, didn't you? To remind yourself that you won? It wasn't like that, Victoria, I said. But the words felt hollow. The truth was more complicated, a marriage that had frayed under the weight of my career. A woman who felt like a ghost in her own home. I hadn't kept the letters as a trophy. I'd kept them because they were the only part of her I didn't understand. Julian showed them to me, Victoria said, standing up. He said you've been holding on to them to use against me if I ever tried to cross you, to show me that my mother didn't even want this legacy you're so obsessed with. He's using her memory to turn you against me, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. That's what he found in the cellar. Not just the evidence of his crimes, but the evidence of my failures. He's the only one being honest with me. She screamed, her composure finally breaking. You've spent your whole life managing people, Dad. You managed Mom until she died, and now you're trying to manage me into a padded cell. Well, it's over. Julian is at the house now. He's clearing out the clutter. He's selling the Silver Star. And the money is going to the Kensington project to fix the mistakes you've been obsessing over. She turned and walked toward the door. Victoria, I called out. Don't let him back in that cellar. There's more. There's something else. She didn't look back. The heavy magnetic lock on the door engaged with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. I was alone. I had no money, no house, no daughter. My reputation was in tatters, and my son-in-law was currently using my own life's work to fund the project that would eventually destroy my family name. I sat on the bed and stared at the white wall. This was rock bottom. I had tried to play the game by the rules of a gentleman, and I had been crushed by a man who didn't even know the rules existed. But as I sat there, the silence began to change. I started to think like the man I used to be. The man who didn't fight for justice, but for the win. I remembered something Silas, the real Silas Montgomery, had told me years ago during a particularly brutal merger. Arthur, if you're going to burn a bridge, make sure the other guy is still standing on it. I looked at the plastic security camera in the corner of the room. I knew Julian was watching. He wanted to see me broken. He wanted to see me give up. I stood up and walked to the camera. I leaned in close, until my face filled the frame. Julian, I whispered, knowing the audio would be piped directly to his phone. You forgot one thing about that wine cellar. You found the letters. You found the reports, but you didn't find the ledger. I saw the camera lens twitch, just a fraction of a millimeter. The ledger isn't in a box, Julian, I said, a slow, predatory grin forming on my face. It isn't on a hard drive. It's written in the one place you'd never think to look. And the moment the SEC sees it, it won't matter how many Ba-Trum Lair high orders you have. You'll be sharing a cell with your transport specialist. I sat back down on the bed. I didn't know how I was going to get out of this ward. I didn't know if Victoria would ever forgive me, but I knew one thing for certain. The revenge plan hadn't failed. It had just finally begun. Because Julian Vane was currently rushing back to the Bryn Mawr estate to find a ledger that didn't exist. And while he was tearing the house apart looking for it, he was going to walk right into the real trap I'd set, the one I'd hidden in the very motor coach he was so desperate to sell. What happened next was the beginning of the end. I whispered to the empty room, and it started with a single phone call from a man Julian thought he'd already buried. The silence of the psychiatric ward was different from the silence of my study. In my study, the silence felt like a canvas, a space for strategy, memory, and the slow sipping of Bordeaux. Here, the silence was clinical and aggressive. It was the sound of a vacuum, designed to suck the personality out of a man until he became nothing but a chart number and a chemical cocktail. I sat on the edge of that bolted-down bed for 3 hours after Victoria left. I didn't move. I didn't pace. I knew Julian was watching that camera, looking for any sign of agitation to justify extending my stay. So, I gave him the most terrifying thing a litigator can offer. Absolute, glacial stillness. I was counting. Not minutes, but the steps Julian would take. He would have left the facility in a rush. He would have driven his Lexus like a madman back to the main line. He'd be in my wine cellar right now, tearing through the racks, shattering vintage bottles in his desperation to find a ledger that didn't exist. Julian was a man built on the fear of being found out. The mere mention of a paper trail was enough to send him into a terminal spin. The door to my room hissed open. It wasn't Dr. Sterling. It was a man in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Julian's car. He was holding a leather briefcase and a look of profound annoyance. "You look like hell, Arthur," Silas Montgomery said, stepping into the room. The real Silas, not the Jax version, not the fake PI, but the man who had stood beside me in court for 3 decades. I felt a surge of adrenaline that nearly brought me to my feet, but I forced myself to stay still. "You're late, Silas," I rasped, my throat still sore from Julian's grip. I had to go to the state capitol to find a judge who wasn't on the Vane family's Christmas card list, Silas said, pulling a sheaf of papers from his bag. "The Bay-Trumlair High Order was a forgery, Arthur. Or rather, the medical affidavit Julian used to secure it was signed by a doctor whose license was suspended 6 months ago for insurance fraud. Imagine that. Julian using a fraudster to commit a fraud." He handed me the papers. "It's a writ of habeas corpus. You're a free man, as of 5 minutes ago. And Dr. Sterling is currently in her office talking to a very unfriendly representative from the district attorney's office." "Victoria?" I asked, the name feeling like a bruise in my chest. "She's at the Bryn Mawr house," Silas said, his expression softening. "She's not under arrest yet, but the police have secured the perimeter. We need to go, Arthur. Julian is still inside. He's claiming spousal privilege to keep the officers from entering the cellar while he recovers personal property." I stood up, the paper gown fluttering around my legs. "He's looking for the ledger." "There is no ledger, is there?" Silas asked with a knowing smirk. "There is something much better," I said, grabbing the clothes Silas had brought for me. I told him the ledger was in the one place he'd never look. He thinks I meant the cellar, but Julian doesn't understand irony. We left the facility through a side exit, avoiding the press that had started to gather. Silas's driver had his black Mercedes idling at the curb. As we sped toward Bryn Mawr, the world seemed to sharpen. The fall colors of the Pennsylvania woods were brilliant, almost painful to look at. I realized then that I hadn't just been fighting for my house or my money. I had been fighting for the right to see the world on my own terms. "What did you mean about the ledger, Arthur?" Silas asked as we hit the turnpike. "Julian is a man of the digital age," I said, looking out the window. "He thinks everything important is on a server or a hard drive. But I was raised by a man who didn't trust anything he couldn't touch. The ledger, the real record of every penny Julian stole, every bribe he paid to the Kensington contractors, and the original environmental survey, it isn't in the house." "Then where?" "It's in the Silver Star legacy," I said. "When I bought that coach, I didn't just buy a vehicle. I bought a mobile vault. I had the manufacturer install a fireproof, lead-lined safe behind the electrical panel in the master bedroom. It's keyed to a physical deadbolt, not an electronic one. And Julian was driving it," Silas murmured. "He was sitting on his own conviction for 400 miles. "Exactly. But there's a problem. Julian told Victoria he was selling the coach to fund the Kensington project. If he's moved it, or if he's already found a buyer." "He hasn't," Silas interrupted, checking his phone. "The state police impounded it, remember? But because of the emergency guardianship, Julian had the legal authority to have it towed to a private lot in Berwyn. He moved it there this morning. Then that's where he'll go next," I said. "Once he realizes the cellar is empty, he'll remember what I said about the one place he'd never look. He'll think I meant the coach." The drive to the Bryn Mawr estate felt like a countdown. We arrived to see 3 police cruisers parked near the gate, their lights off but their presence unmistakable. I stepped out of the car and walked toward my front door. The limestone seemed colder, the windows like dark, unseeing eyes. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the wine cellar entrance at the side of the house. The heavy wooden door was hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of spilled wine. Thousands of dollars of rare Bordeaux and Cabernet lay in shattered heaps on the floor. In the center of the room, Julian was on his knees, his hands bleeding, frantically prying a stone from the wall with a crowbar. "It's not there, Julian," I said from the doorway. He spun around, the crowbar raised, his face a mask of sweat and dirt. He looked like a cornered animal, the prestige and the arrogance stripped away to reveal the desperate, hollow core underneath. "Arthur," he wheezed, his eyes bulging. "How? How are you here?" "The law has a way of correcting itself when the paperwork is forged," I said, stepping over a broken bottle of Bornmuehlum Mouton Rothschild. "You've destroyed my cellar. You've destroyed my daughter's trust. You've even destroyed Eleanor's letters. Was it worth it?" "I'll find it," Julian screamed, lunging toward me. "I know it's here. You're bluffing. You've always been a bluffer." Two officers stepped out from the shadows behind me, their weapons drawn but not raised. Julian froze, the crowbar trembling in his hand. "Drop the weapon, Mr. Vane," the sergeant said. Julian looked at the officers, then at me. He realized then that the gray zone he loved so much had just turned pitch black. He dropped the crowbar. It hit the stone floor with a hollow, pathetic clang. "Where is she?" I asked. "Where is Victoria?" "She's upstairs," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "She wouldn't come down. She hates you, Arthur. She'll always hate you for what you did to her mother." I left the police to handle Julian and walked up the stairs. The house felt alien, the modern renovations Julian had forced upon it now looking like the scars of a botched surgery. I found Victoria in the nursery, the room that was supposed to be for my grandchildren, Sterling and Chloe. She was sitting in a rocking chair, staring at a blank wall. "Tori," I said softly. She didn't look at me. "He showed me the letters, Dad. He showed me how she wanted to leave. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe you were the perfect couple?" I sat on the floor near her, my old bones aching. "Because I wanted you to have a mother who was a hero, Victoria, not a woman who was struggling. And I wanted you to have a father you could look up to, not a man who was so obsessed with building a legacy that he forgot to build a home. I was wrong. I was wrong to hide the truth. And I was wrong to give you this house as a gift, instead of giving you my time." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were hollow, the light gone. "He took everything, didn't he? The money, the project. It's all a lie." "Not everything," I said. "I still have the silver star, and I still have the truth. We can fix the Kensington project, Victoria. We can use the insurance reserves to remediate the soil. It will take years, and the Harrison name will be dragged through the mud, but we can make it right." She stood up, her movement stiff. "I don't want the house, Dad. I don't want the legacy. I just want it to be over." "It is over," I said, but I was wrong. As the police led Julian out in handcuffs, he stopped in the foyer. He looked at Victoria, then at me, and a slow, hideous smile spread across his face. "You think you've won, Arthur?" Julian laughed, a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. "You think the ledger is the only thing I was looking for?" He leaned in, his voice a jagged whisper. "I didn't just sell the motor coach, Arthur. I didn't have to. I found a buyer for the Kensington debt. A man named Silas, not your friend, but the other one. The tactical one. And he's not interested in the ledger. He's interested in the insurance policy you took out on the coach. The one with the total loss clause." My heart stopped. "The insurance policy." "I told him where the coach was, Arthur." Julian grinned, his teeth stained with dirt. "And I told him that if the coach happened to catch fire, while it was in that private lot, the $5 million payout would go directly to the Kensington project's primary creditor, which is now a shell company owned by him." "Julian, what did you do?" Victoria gasped. "I didn't do anything," Julian said as the officers pulled him toward the door. "I just made a phone call. Check the news, Arthur. Berwyn is lovely this time of year, especially at night." I ran to the window. In the distance, toward the west, a plume of thick, black smoke was already beginning to rise above the tree line. The Silver Star legacy, my dream, my vault, my evidence, was burning. I didn't know it yet, I whispered, the heat of a new kind of rage bubbling in my chest. But Julian hadn't just tried to kill me. He had just set fire to the only proof I had left. And what happened next would be the final twist in a story that was no longer about money. It was about blood. I turned to Silas. "Get the car. We have 10 minutes before that safe melts." The night sky over Berwyn was a bruised, angry orange. As Silas's Mercedes tore down the back roads, I could see the pillar of smoke rising like a dark finger pointing at my failures. The Silver Star legacy, my $250,000 dream, was being reduced to an insurance payout. Julian had realized he couldn't have the assets, so he had decided to burn the world down and collect the ashes. "Step on it, Silas," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "If that fire gets into the master suite before we arrive, 40 years of my life goes up in a toxic cloud." "The fire department is already there, Arthur," Silas said, pushing the car to 90. "But Julian's specialist, that tactical version of Jack's, is likely there too, making sure the job is thorough. We aren't just fighting a fire. We're fighting a cleanup crew." When we skidded into the private impound lot, the scene was chaotic. 2 fire engines were positioned near the back of the lot, their hoses snaking across the gravel like prehistoric serpents. The Silver Star was engulfed in the center, a skeleton of blackened aluminum and melting fiberglass. The heat was a physical wall, pushing back the firefighters. I stepped out of the car, the smell of burning rubber and expensive upholstery hitting me like a punch. "You can't go over there, sir," a firefighter yelled, catching me by the shoulder. "The fuel tanks are a hazard. That's my property," I shouted back, pointing at the pyre. "There's a fire-rated vault in the bedroom frame. You have to focus the water on the rear chassis." Through the shimmering heat and the steam, I saw him, Jax or whatever his name was, standing by a black SUV at the edge of the lot. He was holding a thermal imaging camera, watching the coach burn with the clinical detachment of a man checking a grocery list. He saw me, and for a second, a flicker of something like respect crossed his face. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply nodded, climbed into his vehicle, and drove away into the darkness. He knew the job was done. The total loss was achieved. I collapsed against the side of Silas's car, watching the flames lick the sky. I had spent my life calculating risk, but I had never calculated the cost of a daughter who didn't love me and a son-in-law who wanted me dead. "It's over, Silas," I said, the orange light reflecting in my eyes. "The reports, the ledger, the evidence, it's gone." "Not necessarily," Silas said, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Wait for the cooling." It took 3 hours for the fire to be fully extinguished. The Silver Star was a blackened husk, a hollowed-out ghost of the luxury it once represented. When the fire marshal finally cleared us to approach, the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. I walked through the damp ash, my boots crunching on melted plastic. I reached the area where the master bedroom had been. The bed frame was a warped tangle of steel, but beneath it, tucked into the heavy-duty chassis, sat a small, soot-covered box. It was the safe. It was charred. The outer paint bubbled and peeled, but the heavy iron seal was intact. The fire rating was for 4 hours at 2,000 degrees. I whispered, my fingers trembling as I touched the hot metal. Julian thought he was burning evidence. He didn't realize I built this coach to survive a war. We didn't open it there. We took it back to Silas's office in Rittenhouse Square. It took a locksmith 2 hours to bypass the heat-damaged tumblers. When the door finally swung open with a heavy, metallic groan, a puff of trapped, stale air escaped. Inside, the papers were singed at the edges but perfectly legible. The original environmental survey of the Kensington site, the wire transfer records from Julian's offshore accounts, and the real ledger, the one that didn't just show Julian's crimes, but documented the bribes he'd paid to the very officials who had signed my Baytrum Lair high commitment order. But there was one more thing in the safe. Something I'd forgotten I'd tucked in there the night I bought the coach. It was a small, velvet-lined box containing Eleanor's wedding ring and a single, handwritten note she'd left for me on our 30th. "Arthur, the house is just a box. The legacy is just a word. Don't forget to live in the spaces between the lines." I sat in Silas's plush leather chair, clutching that note, and I finally cried. I didn't cry for the money or the house. I cried for the years I'd spent being a litigator instead of a husband, and a provider instead of a father. My legacy wasn't the Harrison name or the Bryn Mawr estate. It was the wreckage I'd left behind while I was busy winning. The resolution came with the cold, surgical precision of a final judgment. With the evidence in the safe, the district attorney's office didn't just arrest Julian, they dismantled him. The Kensington project was seized and Julian was hit with a litany of charges: grand theft, insurance fraud, kidnapping, and witness tampering. Because he had triggered the total loss clause on a vehicle he didn't legally own, the insurance company he tried to scam became the primary witness against him. Julian Vane was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who wanted to live in a guest wing would now spend a decade and a half in an 8x10 cell. Victoria's path was more difficult. She wasn't charged with a crime, I saw to that. I used every ounce of my remaining influence to ensure she was viewed as a victim of Julian's manipulation. But the damage to our relationship was a total loss that no policy could cover. She sold her interest in the Bryn Mawr estate and used the money to move to a small town in the south of France, near where her mother had always wanted to go. She sent me a postcard once a year. No return address. No, I love you. Just a picture of the sea. As for me, I didn't move back into the big house. I couldn't stand the silence of the limestone walls or the smell of Julian's modern renovations. I sold the estate to a land conservancy, ensuring that the 5 acres of gardens would never be developed. I kept enough to live comfortably, and I gave the rest millions of dollars to a foundation for environmental remediation in North Philadelphia. I bought a new coach, not a Silver Star Legacy this time, just a modest, reliable Winnebago, white and gray, with enough room for a small library and a good bottle of wine. I'm currently parked on a cliffside in Big Sur, watching the Pacific Ocean churn against the rocks. The air is salty and cold, and the sun is dipping below the horizon, painting the world in colors that no office window could ever capture. My phone is off. My calendar is empty. Sometimes, I think about I was the man who thought he could insure himself against the world. I realize now that the only thing you can truly protect is your soul, and even then, you have to be willing to let it get a little scorched to know it's real. I'm 67 now. My joints ache when it rains, and I sometimes forget where I put my reading glasses. But my mind is clear. I'm not a confused old man, and I'm not a senior partner. I'm just Arthur. I looked at the topographical map spread out on my small kitchen table. Tomorrow, I'm heading north, toward the redwoods. I didn't know it when I was 30 or 40 or even 60, but the road doesn't care about your prestigious name or your bank account. It only cares that you're moving. Julian thought he was dropping me off at a retirement home. He was wrong. He dropped me off at the beginning of my life. And as the stars begin to poke through the California sky, I realized that the best insurance policy in the world is the one you never have to file a claim on. The simple, quiet peace of a life lived on your own terms. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine purred, a steady, honest heartbeat. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just put the coach in gear and drove toward the dark, beautiful unknown.